Hello, and thank you for having me. Sarah, I suspect that maybe you don't like me very much. She's asked me to talk about an EMR straight after that talk, so bear with me. I would also mention I'm on secondment from the NHS, and I'm sure that has nothing to do with it. Okay, so I'm here to talk about an evaluation that I did in February of the electronic medical record for emergencies, and we did this in Bokoro in Chad. Let's see if this works. Okay, so just to briefly, well, I was going to explain to you what an electronic medical record is. I think that's probably redundant. It's a computer program that allows you to access and work with individual patient data. And this was a particular kind of patient record that was developed initially for use in the Ebola crisis. It's designed to work in the sorts of locations that MSF sometimes works, and you can see an example here on the screen where there is unreliable power, there is no internet, and the work that was done in Ebola was then taken and redeveloped with the vision being that this would be something that could be taken to the field, could be configured at short notice for a number of conditions where a clear view of key patient information would help you improve care. And the possible use cases that we were thinking of were things like HEPI, cholera, Ebola, malnutrition. Okay, so this is the problem that the development team were trying to solve. In the field, your paper records often look like this, repaired. Some of the data is difficult to read. They get dirty, torn, lost. And this was their solution. You can see on the left, is this the pointer? Yeah, so on the left is an example of the patient's screen, if you like, where you can see key patient data, and on the right is one of the forms in which you enter data. So it's important to note that this electronic medical record was designed to replace paper. It was to be used instead of paper at the patient bedside, and the pilot that we did was an attempt to see how well that works. Okay, and just to briefly summarize exactly how it works, on the left you can see a little server. It's an Intel Edison chip running with a database and open medical record software, OpenMRS, I'm sure you've heard of. And on the right you can see the tablets which are connected via a Wi-Fi network to that server, and therefore everyone in possession of a tablet, if it's working properly, will have an up-to-date view of every patient in the facility. So the development team were there to pilot the software. My job was to evaluate the readiness of this software for deployment in the sorts of settings that we're talking about. So I'm not going to go through all of this slide. It was simply to say that there was a very careful process we went through to try and ensure that we were covering the key elements of this technology. And you can see that we were looking at training needs, its ability to be configured, its stability, its acceptability, and the ease with which people could access data, amongst other things. So we'll talk in a little detail about the methods because these are kind of important. We had an audit. There were 25 key requirements for the system that covered different aspects of the system. Could it work in an offline environment? Did it do everything that a paper record could do? Did it have the necessary safety features? And those audits acted also as a safety check that were done before, during, and after the pilot. I had a list of key tasks that occur in malnutrition care, and I was to look at those when people were using paper records and then when they were using the electronic record and see what differences we could observe. I did interviews with staff and to really find out their views and experience of using the technology. We designed a comprehension test to test the hypothesis of whether actually that rather attractive user interface that I showed you, would that allow you to access data more quickly and more accurately than the paper record. And I also did something called a Delphi questionnaire, essentially a way of generating consensus among experts who are geographically dispersed. And we did that to try and assess the technical strengths and weaknesses of the system. So to give you some results, the audit we conducted when we came home, you can see that a number of the key operational criteria were met. Okay, and these included particularly the ability to replicate what was on paper records and some of the key offline features. Unfortunately, also a number of very important criteria were not met. And actually, because of the results of this audit, halfway through the pilot, we changed our plan from one of complete implementation and removing paper entirely to a dual entry using paper and electronic records to maintain patient safety and to gain as much learning as we could from the pilot. And probably one of the key points here is that the stability and the ability of the server to handle the load of data that a normal number of patients would generate was actually not as good as it needed to be. We did the comprehension test, and actually we found no significant difference between paper and the electronic record in terms of the ability to access information and the accuracy with which that information was processed. There are no standardized tests for this. We devised our own. We did it in the field, but that was as good as we could do. Interviews gave us quite interesting information. When I interviewed people, absolutely everybody I spoke to was desperately keen to use the technology. And I think it was obviously a real source of personal and national pride in an environment in Chad where most people have had no exposure whatsoever to technology. To have the opportunity to do that was obviously a big plus for them. But when we observed people's behavior, you could see that engagement varied. Some professions were more engaged than others. Interestingly, nutritional assistants were probably the most engaged. And particularly for those in senior positions, as the workload increased, perhaps inevitably given that we were double entering data, the engagement maybe decreased. Staff said that they felt that they had a requirement for a training need of perhaps a month to become really comfortable with using this technology. And that does not sit with the vision of this, which was for something that could be rapidly deployed in an emergency. And because we had 13 patients over 12 days on this system, we couldn't sensibly assess whether or not there was a benefit to patients from using this. The results of the Delphi questionnaire, we sought the views of 6 of the 7 development staff who'd worked on the project while I was involved with it. And there are a number of key technical strengths. The system was designed from the ground up to work in an offline environment, and you can install, backup, and restore the software from a USB stick, which is an innovative feature which worked extremely well during the pilot. You can also configure the forms, the pieces of data you want to record, how they're displayed. All that can be configured via an Excel spreadsheet, and that, although it was a draft version, also worked well. There were, however, some serious weaknesses to the system. It had been developed by a number of different developers, often in somewhat of a hurry, and as a result, we had a very complex code base which contributed to the instability of the system. In addition, as I've mentioned before, the server didn't have sufficient power to deal with that workload, and that somewhat dry point about synchronization actually translates to, can you trust the information that you see on your screen when you're treating a patient? If you have a server holding a database of patient information, you need to know that the information on your tablet is 100% reflective of the information on that database. Otherwise, you are potentially going to make decisions based on inaccurate information. And on a small number but important number of occasions, we observed some problems with that. So, to conclude, what went well? I think we demonstrated, or the development team demonstrated, that an electronic medical record for use in emergencies that could function in an environment without power, without access to the internet, could be rapidly configured, is technically feasible. Some of the innovative features worked well, and the user interface is very attractive and has some of that will be used in other work ongoing. In terms of my study limitations, as I mentioned, we only implemented this kit for 12 days with 13 patients, so there's a limit to the inferences that can be drawn, particularly around impact on patients. However, it's important to note that the EMR-E as is not ready for deployment for the reasons listed there. What I wanted to do was then place this in the wider context of the use of electronic medical records in humanitarian settings. Within Operational Centre Amsterdam, or MSF Amsterdam, we are using electronic medical records in certain circumstances already. for example, outpatient care of TB and HIV, and that's been shown to be helpful and effective. This particular piece of kit is a very specific use case aiming to replace paper and to be used to be configurable for an emergency. And I think this work started with Ebola. We broadened its scope to several other scenarios, and we have come back, I think, to a very clear use case for where we think something like this might be useful, where you have a need for a very small number of data fields, where a standard data collection app would not be sufficient, where paper presents serious problems. For example, with a severe biohazard, you can't get the data out of the red zone to analyze it to then understand what constitutes effective care. And perhaps where we have poor existing outcomes which would justify the investment and the risk involved. Finally, all the code that has been, all the work that's been done on this is on an open source platform, and it's freely available to anyone who wishes to interact with it. I leave you with this. My background is in the NHS. I've been in the NHS for 10 years, and I'm on a year-long secondment to MSF. And I guess I leave you with a question as to how does MSF, we have very different attitudes towards risk in the NHS compared to NSF, and that's one of the things I've observed. So in MSF, you have a high tolerance for risk, partly because you have to, because of where you or we work. In the NHS, we're much more risk averse. And how does MSF innovate but protect the interests of the people that it serves? How does it do new things that are required without placing unnecessary risk on those patients? That's the question I'd like to leave you with. I acknowledge everybody involved in the project, and thank you very much for your time and attention.